Welcome, Birch.
Hi, Serafina. Hi.
So good to have you here.
Well, thank
So I've
you.
wanted to do this for so many years to record you and I, and for everyone watching, Robert Birch and I are best friends going on 20 years. We've had a tradition of speaking almost every day, having our daily check-in.
Every
We've
morning,
shared
8 a.m.
Yes, we've shared so many rituals from a huge Asclepion ritual reenactment that maybe we'll talk about tonight that we did maybe 12 years ago to rituals in the California redwoods and in the hills behind where we live. We've facilitated groups. We have been in a full moon coven for years. The list goes on. So we're best friends of heart and soul. And I think we go back many lifetimes. And we've also had the gift and opportunity to collaborate together as co-facilitators, ritualists, priestesses. And I've always wanted to share our magical conversations with others. And many times we've been on our hour-long, sometimes 3-hour-long conversations thinking, wouldn't it be neat to share this with other people? So here we are. So thank you for joining me.
Sure.
And it's just such an honor to have you.
Thanks, Serafina. It's good to be.
Now, as you know, ancestral healing and ancestral work has been part of both of our work independently and together for a long time. And I've been doing these plant spirit initiations and ancestral healing practices with plants. And you're also a practitioner of this art in your own way. So I'd love to know if you can talk about your work, what got you started in ancestral healing. When I met you, which was nearly 20 years ago, you were facilitating ancestral story projects. But I
Mhm.
know that your work in this, shall we say, this frequency goes back even further.
Just talking about some of how I dropped into looking at ancestral medicine, or specifically ancestral magic, I was as an adoptee. So not knowing where my roots were, having a vague understanding that by following my own ancestral roots, I would get to some of those deeper feelings of dislocation and find out where I had a sense of belonging. So that was part of it. But then what shifted to a practice was when we were at our very first, it was California Witch Camp, probably 15 years ago. Do you remember the myth that year?
Yeah, it was more like 16 or 17 years now. It
Wow.
was Psyche and Eros.
Psyche and Eros, right? And which was an extraordinary experience to show up with 100 other witches at the same time and going deep into the woods. But what I realized then was there was no ancestral altar. So I went out to this old fire pit, stone fire pit, and set up an altar. And it was a way of grounding me into the experience of negotiating who I was with my ancestry. So I was able to call in my ancestors and say, hey, I'm a white cisgendered gay man, I'm a faggot, and I live with HIV. And so many of these things, a huge part of my life, a lot of my recent ancestors, the last several generations, I would be like the part of them that they wouldn't want to see in themselves. I would represent being a witch and all these other things. So I felt like, coming from a Christian Euro background, I need to do some kind of negotiation process. And it's similar, it felt like it was similar to that bargaining stage when we're afraid to lose something. But at the same time, what I came up with was I offered them a deal. I'm just making this up at the time and just saying, look, one of the things I'd like to offer you is, for your support, that any kind of healing that I'm experiencing in my life, I want to be able to translate it back to you. I want to be able to honor you by acknowledging that health and healing are a huge part of what's needed in my life right now and in the world. And that with their support, if they could support me in some of the pieces of the work I was doing, that would be my way of honoring and remembering them. And so ideally, loosening them from some of the traumas and horrors that they probably went through too. Yeah, so that was kind of where it all started. And in that particular trance state I was in, an ancestral guide came to me, you know, and I was able to track back to kind of 5 generations ago, a grandfather on my father's side. And it felt like I was being introduced to a gatekeeper, because
And
just this idea of, yeah, the gatekeeper, just because the idea of having so many ancestors was utterly overwhelming.
yeah, yeah. And when they showed up to you, did they say anything, or was it more of a felt sense? How did they?
Well, it was a quality of welcome home, right? That feeling that we all know when we come back together again. And that was this warm sensation of being seen. And actually, as a gatekeeper, he's always been very silent, but he's brought me to another ancestral magic that you and I have done. He's often the one that shows up, kind of opens the portal, and then I get to meet and actually have exchange like moments. But in terms of actually doing anything with him in particular, that's never happened. He's been more of this silent psychopomp energy.
Yeah, well, that brings up a good point where I feel like there's different kinds of ancestral guides, right? And different kinds of ancestors. And I think one of my pivotal moments in understanding this is it must have been way back again, that first witch camp in California, where one of our teachers, friends, and one of my initiators, Urania, said, when we call on the ancestors, hi, Urania, we love you. When we call on the ancestors, we don't want all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We don't want all of them, because there are the troubled ancestors. Those are the ones that we may need to or want to protect ourselves from. There are the ancestors of the craft, which are those ancestors who may not be related to us through blood. They may be ancestors of a particular lineage. So there may be times where I want to call upon the ancestors of one of my crafts, whether that be classical homeopathy or herbalism, Western herbalism, or plant, the herbalists, the gardeners. There might be ancestors that are connected to our political activism. There might be, so there's so many different kinds of ancestors. And I just love how you describe that. I think that's important for people to hear, that there might be some guides that are silent and the gatekeepers, as you say, the one who is the watcher and maybe even the protector.
Yeah, I love how we call it the mighty dead. Those are the ancestors that you said that are part of our practice, and however we show up in our lives, there's a certain practice to what we're doing. And to see ancestral process as an ancestral practice is something has been around for centuries, but I think it's growing in our times right now as we're feeling so lost and confused. Again, those are the feelings and associations I had as a young child, as an adoptee. I sense that. I think one of the great tragedies in life, you and I have talked about this before, in the generational trauma that we all inherit, is the great diaspora. Where people are having to leave the lands that their ancestors' bones are in. And I think for a lot of us as settlers and discovering how to decolonize our experiences of life, we're also necessarily returning back to where some of our ancestors are from, to understand how we carry that grief with us, and how that subverted grief and repressed grief in today's cultures are causing a lot of the agitation and illness in the world.
Yeah, I think that's important, because there is this phenomenal, intriguing resurgence of interest in ancestral healing. And I think part of that is popularized by Daniel Four, who wrote a book a number of years ago, and his work has kind of gone viral and it's out there. But there are practitioners who've been doing it since the time immemorial. But I think it's important what you're saying. There are a number of settlers and white Europeans, North Americans who have developed or who have awoken to this fascination of doing ancestral healing. And like you say, I think it is, when I speak to my clients, students, there is something about what to do with this grief that feels centuries old in our hearts and in our souls, the sense of displacement. And I think in a way that has certainly been sloppy, I think a lot of spiritual New Ageism is about trying to find a sense of place, trying to find a sense of where do I belong.
Yeah.
And so we, and certainly I'll include myself in this, especially when I was younger, trying on different cultural, spiritual traditions and trying on different, whether it be through dress, whether it be through different forms of ritual, and even when I think about myself as a teen, just trying to find myself spiritually. And of course, that causes harm to many traditions that are living still today, who've been harmed by those acts.
Can I ask a question for a second then?
Yeah.
So would you say, how you, other people we know, navigating these, what you're referring to as cultural appropriation, of course, and where this ancestral medicine is landing in our lives today, this compelling need, I'd say, for a lot of us to understand that we're located in space and time. But what is the practice, and how is it emerging away from appropriation into integration, I guess you could say?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is knowing the history of our own lineages to the best that we can. Because as like you, there are folks who are adoptees and who don't know that information, but there are ways, and maybe you can speak to that, ways to connect still to your ancestry with the information that you do have. But what I'm seeing in my students, especially, and peers, is as white people and as people, like, I'm very mixed. My heritage is, one of my grandparents would refer to us as European mutts with a little bit of Middle Eastern in there. And I think part of the reclamation and the attempt to be more conscious and aware of not practicing cultural appropriation is to know where I come from in my lineage, and what are those stories? What are the stories that my ancestors, those who are still here, my grandparents and great grandparents, and what were their lives? What were their stories? And how can I be responsible to those who did commit harm? Because I think there's this romanticism of, especially perhaps in someone's earlier spiritual development, to romanticize whatever spirituality they've woken up to, let's say, and to romanticize our ancestors. As kids, kids sometimes like to pretend or play or imagine my ancestors were Cleopatra or Caesar or some romantic historical figure. But I think in that there's a desire to know, where did I come from and who are my people? Because
who do I belong to?
Who do I belong to? Because so many of us have, through generations, moved away from those ancestral homes. So to get back to your question, I think how some people are doing this healing work and attempting to do it in a conscious, caring way is to be responsible to my ancestors, both the perpetrators of harm and the perpetrators of white supremacy and oppression, and to also tend and be responsible to the ancestors that may have done good deeds, that were the healers. So I recognize that I may not know all those stories except through my dreams and visions, but I have ancestors who were violent and perpetrators and committed horrific acts. And I know that I have ancestors who were healers and poured goodness onto the earth. And the work in my personal private practice is to reconcile, if you will, or do what I can to integrate both of those pieces, because I feel both of those lines in my body, in me. Going back to early memories as a child, I can feel the violence and I can feel the goodness.
Yeah. I think one of the most upsetting but powerful ancestral rituals I did, and it was an early attempt to understand that this life's experience is also, of course, like all of our lives, are rooted in violence, war, famine, disease. And so I think I just want to put a trigger warning out here. I think that's fair to do, because it's leading into some of the actual practical uses of how we can participate in our ancestral healing. I was in a trance space inside a ritual, and I went to meet the first perpetrator of violence against women. And I won't go into the specifics of the detail, but it was an attempt to move to an experience of, well, I'll share what I did. Essentially it was going back to the Fisher King myth and seeing that the old white man who had perpetrated violence was wounded, and lancing that wound, and having the women in my lineage on the other side of a river. And for me as a male in life was to take on that responsibility of recognizing that it was up to me to look at the violence that the men in my lineage have participated in, and to imagine in my mythic imagination, to go back to those first moments, and that to speak to that ancestor and say, I do not consent to this, and nobody in my line consents to this. And to take that responsibility on, to start there, that we do have we're not, as you said, doing a spiritual bypass, that we're actually participating in the health and healing of the planet this time by acknowledging where we've come from, and accountability. There's no health and healing without accountability. So to go to some of those edgier places, I think does take the kind of quality of support that I've got in my life with other men's groups and my witchcraft community. But I do think it's necessary that we don't take, obviously, a Pollyanna view of what this medicine's really all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I remember you telling me that story many times. And I think what's important here is that what you just told is a healing ritual. I mean, that's how ritual can heal. Ritual is a healing modality, and it has been for thousands of years. And I love that example because it speaks to the way in which we can move through whole time using the modality of ritual in sacred
Can you just
space.
explain a little bit of what
Yeah.
whole time is?
So whole time to me is slipping into that space that's almost timeless. It's where we go when we're in a ritual, a ceremony, a magical, what one might call a magical moment, whether that be sitting by a river or by the ocean, and just being so present in that moment. It's as if time stops. And we're in the space in between. We're between the veils. We're in that place where anything can happen. And it feels like, depending on how we direct our energy, we can will something to happen. It's those magical moments. And it's in those moments where I too have had conversations with my ancestors when I know that I'm wrestling with something that is beyond me. And I think that's one of the ways our ancestors or our blood, our spirit shows us what needs to be healed, is when we're wrestling with something that seems to be, it's like it has us. Sometimes I know this can be a triggering word, but it's like a possession.
Yeah.
There's something that has possessed my heart or my soul, or why do I carry this grief? And why am I so moved by this, or tormented even by this piece in this theme in my life? The
pattern that we're operating in, but can't always see, given our day-to-day life.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And so in those moments, that's when I too have confronted what I would consider the troubled ancestors, those ancestors that are showing what needs to be healed. And I'm thinking about a ritual that I was in, I think you were there too, of 100 people dancing around a fire for hours and hours and hours. And I went into the center and I had photos of my father and I had photos of some other ancestors. And in that powerful moment, I just said, enough of the victimhood. And I no longer consent to being a victim in this particular pattern that I was working at that time. And with the support of other healers with me in that ritual, I could literally feel that I was cutting the cord and removing a thorn out of my body. And there's been a couple of moments you were there, and Ed Wolf was there removing a thorn from my body. Yeah, removing an old pattern from my body.
Yeah, these inherited patterns affect our behaviors, our choices, our lifestyle. And to do the work you're talking about requires support. None of us got into our problems by ourselves, and none of us are going to get out of it by ourselves. And that's true of working with our troubled ancestors. It often takes a bit of it takes a team effort, if you will, to understand that we can't go back to that miasmic state, those delusional states, and think that we're going to get out of the delusion ourselves.
Yeah, and these are legacies of pain, and these legacies of pain intersect with the current crises in the world. When I think about the ancestors, the generations of people who committed acts of crime, and that pain is passed on through the generations until it is healed. And I believe that so many of the crises that we see today, whether it be political, whether it be environmental, connected to sexism, racism, classism, these are literally legacies of pain passed on to us from our ancestors. And that doesn't remove us of any responsibility, those of us who are here, but I do believe that they're greater than us. Yeah. They're greater than just what's here in this generation.
Well, I think that these supremacies act as a possession, right? Yeah. And we have to understand that in each time and place, there's been that form of violent oppression, suppression, and these supremacist constructs. So we have to know that those are the patterns that we're all wrestling with in our DNA, literally, in our blood and bones, and as well as in our psyche. So it's humbling to be part of a generation that is fully beginning to understand the need for decolonization. And decolonization is really decolonizing ourselves from those supremacist constructs. And that in itself is one of the great weavings of ancestral medicines. Knowing the paradox of our time is that we're not going for moving forward unless we deal consciously and constructively with the past violence, as well as all the goodness. Let's call that in as well. Like the part of being able to explore some of the grief and trauma also means that we have greater access to love and joy and creativity, that we're also part of that river of life.
Yeah, I think that's important. And in the ritual, the style of rituals that we've done, when we're doing this big work, working with these persistent patterns, these patterns that are burdens or the legacy of pain, we're also calling upon the healthy, healed, elevated ancestors to participate in that work, right? The mighty dead, the ones that are strong and radiant and well and healthy. And those are the ones that we've called our magical kin or our magical guides. So do you want to talk?
Could I interrupt you for a second? Because you have, and it's not a new practice for you, but you've started talking about it again, about going to bed at night. And just to actually, prior just to slipping into that liminal realm of sleep and dream, you actually call in. Who do you call in and how do you do it?
Yeah. So ever since I was a child, I've always seen this one wild-haired female ancestor in a cave, and she doesn't speak English or any language that we know. And when I told my mom about her, my mom also said she sees her too. And so I consider her one of my ancestral guides, and she has this luminous heart energy. She's wild. She's very primal. I would say, I don't know, from a time before we had any language, formal language. So when I am falling asleep at night, one thing that gives me comfort, especially if there's something I'm wrestling with or struggling with, just as I'm slipping into the sleep time, I imagine I'm touching her, I'm connecting with her. So I reach with my mind's eye, I reach with the power of my intent. I see her in the cave, I see her with her wild black coils of hair, and I make contact. And when I do that, I am just overcome with this wash of soothing light. And if there's something laying heavy on my heart, I'll hand it over to her. And when I'm doing some big healing work, I call upon her. And over the years, what's happened as she's introduced me to a whole other frequency of ancestral guides. And this is why I am so passionate about this work, because these relationships evolve just like human relationships evolve. They're not static. So as I've built this relationship with her, I reach beyond. And there was just a point in my own growth where she introduced me to this realm of ancestors that presents, I can't see their physical form. They're the shape of light. And And they are connected to my bloodline, and they're older than I can even conceive, hundreds of thousands of years. And the messages that I've got is one message I was given is that who we call the angels are actually our ancestors who have completed certain evolutionary cycles. And there's such a high vibration or frequency. They're beyond personality or personal character. They're just, I would say, almost star energy, ancient star energy. And so this ancestor has introduced me to them, but only in the last 7 or 8, maybe 10 years. And so as I'm falling asleep, I connect with her, and then she shows me this angelic realm. And when I connect with them, I'm instantly asleep. But just before I go to sleep, I will hand over, because they want to help me. They want to help us. So
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Yeah.
I mean, I can hear the enthusiasm, the yesness of it. But
yeah.
when you say that, what does that mean?
It's like their light illuminates even greater and reaches for me. And it's like it's like a felt sense where they say, it's almost like they're not, I don't hear this, but it's like a feeling where they're saying, give me your burden. And so if a family member is struggling, if I'm struggling, I will hand those burdens over to them, because they're so strong and so potent, a greater frequency than anything on the earth, that what's heavy and burdensome to me is like nothing to them. And that's the way I sleep really well. That's one way that I manage any poor sleep. But also I'll wake up feeling refreshed, and I'll have insight on whatever it is that I'm working through.
I want to say, since you introduced me to that part of your practice, I'm really moved just by hearing about it. And part of it, I think, is because you had, I'm in your herbal class, your beginner herbal class, which I've always wanted to do. And you had us take suggested rose for those of us who have had sexual abuse histories. And after I was doing my ancestral work, that particular ritual I referred to, I later learned after my father had died that he'd actually been abused as a 10-year-old.
Oh, wow.
And my mother, I knew her story a little bit. So I take this rose tincture that you gave me, and I take it each night with that same intention, but I haven't crafted, it's enough just to do that for me, just to know that I'm doing that practice on their behalf and how I'm carrying the energy of their story. But for me, what I'm hearing from you tonight is that this expansive, almost pre-formed pattern in the pattern, there's the light and just that the welcoming, opening spaciousness. It's almost pre-ancestral, if you will. And I feel the goodness in my heart just about hearing about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's these practices to think about ending a day and just feeling enveloped by our own ancestral line, as kind of in preparation for death, if you will. And if you want to just jump to the end of the story, our story is all an extraordinary practice in preparation, like the Buddhists do, perhaps, in preparation for those moments of letting go. And you're already demonstrating that on a nightly basis.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, so much of what we do is on behalf of others. And there's one of the pieces I'd like to share that has affirmed. There you are taking. Are you taking rose?
Oh, rose and honey.
So good. Tell us, I'll just
Oh.
pause on my story, but tell us what you feel.
Because we're into it now, and because it's been part of my practice since you introduced this in September, it's really moving. It's heart opening. And it feels like, if I was described as an energetic metaphor, it's like a cup can hold the grief, just enough grief, and not too much. It just feels like it's being held in a solid container. Yeah, thanks.
Well, what I love about bringing plant medicine into ancestral work is the plants can hold us. They know our stories, right? We've co-evolved with plants. So they have, just as we carry legacies of pain, but also joy and healing, they too hold this frequency. They've been offering themselves as healers, again, since time immemorial. And every plant carries its own signature. It has the constituents or the volatile oils or the tannins or saponins or glycosides, but plants also have this their own personality and their signature of what their work is. You could almost say, just as we each have our own path, our own offering for the world, so do plants. And the signature of their whole rose family is that of matters of the heart. And rose, especially, I love working with the wild roses that are all over the place here where we live. But rose especially is good medicine to unburden the heart, especially where there's been grief or pain or loss, sexual abuse, grief around anything to do with childbirth or labor or heartbreaks, love, loss, disappointments.
And again, the thorns, right, for protection and boundary setting.
Exactly. So it's for those who are too prickly, but also those who don't have firm enough boundaries. So it's a teacher of boundaries, no matter what end of the spectrum you might be residing on.
So how else this is part of your great investigation, is around human ancestry, obviously, but also the ancestry of the green bloods.
Yeah.
And I think this notion of boundaries, of course, is one of our great needs to understand and practice in our lives. But how does your work around the green and the red bloods, how can it establish healthier boundaries in our own ancestral investigations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I like to bring in plants in these practices, as you said, as boundary keepers. Because, well, I use a few herbs. I love elecampane. I use rose. I use pine, the whole pine family. There's other trees I like to use. And they're guides. They sort of direct our experience, if you will. And I think they're especially useful for folks who are newer to ancestral work. Not only, those who are very experienced too, but particularly for the newer students, I like to ensure that we have herbs with us because they act as those protectors between us and perhaps the ancestors we don't want to be calling in, or the ones who may be curious and may meddle. So elecampane and the pine trees are good protectors. They're like the gatekeepers that hold and focus our work. And so too, the herbs drop us down out of the talking mind and into the body. And activate our nervous system, just as those who are watching this saw that happen. Like when you took those drops of rose, your whole nervous system shifted.
Oh, it's amazing. My arms are there's a warm flush in the top of
Yeah, exactly. So our body's open, our cells open. We store memories in our cells. Many of the stories that we carry are living in our body, not our head, not our mind, or even our memory in our head. It's not about cognition. So in the ancestral practices that I facilitate, it's about dropping into the body and listening to the wisdom of the body, the instinctual self, the intuitive self. In a way, we want to soften the mind that we use in our day-to-day life and our work life and our task-oriented life, and drop into that liminal space, to use that term again, whole time, where we can slip between the rational and into the irrational, which is the magical, the liminal, the numinous.
Yeah.
And it's in that place where we can heal, where we can repattern, where we can reorganize, and we can do the repatterning work that you and I are talking about. That's where we go when we're in ritual space.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think about when I was in Greece in 2017 with 7 other priestesses. We went to Crete and visited the ruins of these ancient Asclepions, were these healing temples that you did your master's on. And what struck me is that in the Asclepions, they did things like surgery and body work and healing, but they did sacred theater. They reenacted stories, and it was sacred drama.
Yeah, they're playing out the dynamics, playing within the patterns consciously.
Exactly, playing within the patterns consciously, which I would say is your area of expertise. And then they would also drink various herbal concoctions, and they would have the dream. They would sleep, have a dream, or have a vision, and then the priestess would help them interpret that dream, and that would be their medicine, and that might even be what they reenact the next day. They would sometimes do these rituals for weeks.
And there's hundreds of accounts logged of the exchange between those that experienced some kind of healing and what they offered the priestesses and priests of the temple, like whether it was a chicken or whatever that they would the exchange, but they're actually logged what some of the shifts in consciousness people had. They had spontaneous mutual healings in these sacred temples.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened when you were there?
Oh my.
What's some of what happened?
Well,
the powerful priestesses.
I mean, we were 8 altogether, I believe. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone, but I believe we were 8. And we had a few nights where we would be in these old ancient places far away from the cities. And we just went into spontaneous ritual with each other, for each other, in the great wilderness. And one of the memories I have, the southern tip of Crete, the town was far, far away. And we were near the ruins of this tiny Asclepion. Some of them were massive, but this one was tiny. And in the caves of the hills, in the hills were these caves where apparently people lived in the ancient world, and then they would also go and sleep after their healing experience. So the dreams we had, and the one night we were there, it was a full moon, and we dropped in. I mean, it's hard to describe because we were so in another reality, in another portal, but it was one of those moments where we definitely felt like we slipped between time and space and reality, and met each other in that place because I was with people that we know and have known for a long, long time. So we could entrust each other to do this deep work, and we channeled for each other. We did rituals for each of us, had a moment in the ritual seat, if you will. We had visions. It was extraordinary. And I think one of my takeaways was just how these traditions are still alive in the soil of this earth. And that's one of the reasons I feel so devoted to this work. And I'm curious, I wonder if this is why ancestral healing and ancestral magic is sort of trending right now, is because the earth is asking for us to wake up to this. Because it's about being in relationship with the earth, in relationship with plants. It's not that us humans are having this experience solo. We're not just part of nature, we're also nature. Mm-hmm. And I think about Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, and how she's so eloquently and beautifully spoken about the necessity to come back to relationship with the wider field of the other than human beings on this earth. So the stone people, the plant people, the tree people, the water people.
Yeah,
and
that
so
animist worldview.
The animist
everything's
worldview.
Full of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And being in Crete, I have some Greek in my ancestry. So being in Greece for me, and in particular Crete, being in that ancient world, what struck me is how alive it is. Like those ancestors, those stories, those rituals were still walking that earth. You just had to slow your nervous system down and open to that portal. But also what stood out to me is how I couldn't wait to leave Greece. And I think that was because I know that some of my ancestral burden comes from that line, the part of my family that is Greek through my father, and the heaviness that I feel, I know comes through that portal. So being in Greece for me was heavy. I felt the ancestral burden. And I was conflicted with that because the friends that I was with, they loved it. They wanted to live there. They wanted to go back next summer. But I was almost nauseous with the weight of the burden that I felt. And what was interesting to me, that my very last or second to last day, I spoke to a woman who was a shop owner. She sold beeswax, honey, and herbs. And I got talking to her. We had lots to talk about, but I said to her, and it was the first moment it came off my lips where I said, I feel heaviness being here. And she looked me square in the eye and she said, I do too. And she's born and raised in Greece and her family's been there forever. And she said, we carry burden on top of burden. And she described the atrocities of the history of Greece, and how she was saying her ancestors, my ancestors, went back and forth between being the victims and then the perpetrators, the victims and then the perpetrators. And she said that blood is still in the soil here.
Yeah.
And she said, there's something about living among ruins, these ancient temples. She said, it's heavy. These temples aren't composted to the earth and regenerated as new land, new trees, new bushes and grass. She said, it's just here.
I'm thinking, as you're talking about Kimmer's notion that it's all in reciprocity, right? Like life is in reciprocity with itself.
Yeah.
And that quality of vitality, that is cut off through all the violence that we're referring to. That this burden, this ancestral burden, is when that reciprocity of spilt blood that hasn't been honored, when whether it was through sacrifice or through violence. I mean sacrifice in terms of somebody offering their life force on behalf of their families and their communities. But when that's not fully honored and made sacred, I think that the shadow of the burden, I love that we're talking about burden, because it is a burden. And with that burden comes the need for an accountability. So for you, just to go back into the story, how did you, I don't know, reconcile that process within yourself, having had these powerful opening experiences and then walking away feeling that burden?
Well, a couple of things. One is it made me so aware of how much I and us humans, we walk around carrying burdens thinking they're ours alone. And they're not. Like I think I walked away understanding how the idea of the individual is a modern idea. And speaking to this shopkeeper and talking about her history, and there I am, born and raised in Canada, and there she is, been in Greece for generations. It struck me how, how can I put this into words? Like just how much of what we carry is not ours alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how, and then as a healer, as a priestess, it also affirmed my path, my work to live in this moment present, like live in my life and claim what is mine and continue the sacrificial work of healing and mending and letting go. Like I think about traditional cultures around the world and how every traditional culture that I've been exposed to or studied or learnt about, there are practices of purification, of letting go, of depossession, of cleansing, of ancestral healing. I mean, this is not new. This is not new at all.
Yeah, but also within that reciprocity, I think we're channeling, or we're going down two very obviously interrelated paths. You think of the caduceus, right, the twin snakes, the paradox of this, the horrors, but also one of the things we do have to offer them in that reciprocity between the present and the past and the present and the future this whole time, which is probably just a field of reciprocity. I just love that word, what Kimmer brought in, is that we can offer in our witchcraft and our practice an ecstatic, when we go into those ecstatic states where the death and the rebirth are all happening in this high peak moment, that is also something we can offer the burden of our ancestors, that intergenerational trauma that we're talking about, that this ecstasy isn't because we're moving out of the me, and when we're co-creating an ecstatic state, we can direct that energy, those as offerings, not just to resolve the past, but to see it, to feel the burden of it and the pain of that, but also recognize that life is, when it's in its greatest sense of flow, is that the potency that we're talking about, that life force that that often in your teachings talk about, that this is something it's not frozen in time and space. I think
Exactly.
this is part of our practice.
Yeah, it's not, that's right. And just to conclude that piece that I came home with from Greece is as you say, when I was saying, like, my devotion was to live my life here, and now my life in this current reality and incarnation, and then to send the healing work and doses of every ritual I do back through time to repair those burdens. Because this is the thing in ancestral practice, it's reciprocal and it's reparative.
Yes.
So what I do in my life, in my ritual, in my practices today and now, I can send to my father who died 20 years ago. I can send doses of that healing to my lineage through the lines. I can be sending that magic and that healing, those remedies back through time. So it isn't just one directional, right? Unidirectional. It's multiple. And that I think is an important piece around I think about it like spiritual housekeeping, or it's like welcoming the blessings of the healed ancestors, the holy ones, and then to be sending the good healing and the good magic to those ones who still need it. Because I think, as I say, a lot of the pain that we are feeling in the collective is that the burden of the intergenerational trauma that's wanting our attention. It's wanting to be healed. And so as ritual artists and as healers, I do feel that it's part of our work to mend on this level with my patients and clients and students, but also to be sending that healing through the portal to those disturbed ancestors and also back through time.
So thank you. I mean, it's really inspiring. I just wanted to add on to your story, if I can, just because I know it so well, is that after you had experienced, I think it was around the same time, you had gone back there. And even though it's a different side of your family, the women in your lineage all showed up here on Salt Spring Island, right?
Yeah.
So there is that sense of, when I'm working with clients, and again, if they're in a pattern that they just have no sense of, there's almost despair around resolving, is going back, not just to the parental Freudian approach to it, but going back to the mythos of one's family.
Yeah.
And what happens, I've seen this in myself and others time and time again, is that once we actually start to do some of this unblocking and reparative work that you're talking about, a lot of the dynamics that are in our lived day-to-day experience start to shift as well. And some of those more immediate familial patterns also start to experience the benefit of the work that we're doing. Can you say, I don't know, would it feel okay to talk a little bit about how that's moved forward into your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I mean,
it's a big conversation, I know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say, but just in brief, after that journey and some of the rituals I did, my grandparents on my mother's side moved here. My sister got married, and then my grandfather died. My sister got divorced. I broke up with my partner, and then I had two baby nieces born. So there was this huge, and I'm not saying it's because I went to Greece and did this healing work, but there is a significant shift that took place.
A lot happened immediately within many
18 months. Within
18 months.
About 18 months through three generations through my family.
And all these highs and lows. And interesting, I think one of the future conversations we'll have is about using ritual from what we understand to be like a mental health first aid process, right? But what I witnessed in you, having had these rich experiences, and I think just because this is the context the lens we're talking through tonight, the ancestral work, your ability to regulate yourself through those highs and lows, you brought a depth and a presence to the intensity of what you experienced in those following 18 months.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I think you brought a sense of, for the conversation tonight, let's call it an ancestral presence. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the one thing I have an ability to do, and you do too, is to track the patterns and the energetics of what's happening while it's happening. Yeah, it's been intense.
And I do think, I think it would be good to talk a little bit about the hows of what we do tonight too.
Yeah.
But I want to pick up on this notion of the ancestral presence is I think the more and more we open these possibilities, these channels, and these experience of rooting ourselves in history, the history of the earth, as much as our own familial history, is that depth, that soulfulness is brought to the challenges of our day. I've mentioned that already, but I do think it's like its own double seeing we talk about in the craft a lot, that we open up other channels of perception. And to bring to some of the work we're doing, whether it's your practice as a homeopath and a healer, or as mine as a counselor or a facilitator, there is that invitation to bring the ancestors into the room with us.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to move forward without them, as we're saying tonight. So to see through that heart's lens adds a level of richness when we're creating containers together, whether it's a conversation or an event.
Well, this is the thing too, as we cultivate a relationship with those loving guides, those ancestors that are the loving guides. There's a mutual nourishment, a mutual benefit that happens. So I know when I am tending my ancestors well, and I invite them to the room, I invite them to the table, I invite them to the rituals, and I sometimes even invite them into the healing sessions when I have one-on-ones with my patients, or with permission, I'll ask my patients to invite in theirs as well. Synchronicity happens, magic happens. It's like the boon, this extra boon arrives. And that's when we have things line up, and it's rich. It adds such a rich dimension to life. And I think that's, as we move in, and I think we should talk about the how and some of the practicalities that people can take away from this work, is I do want to say that it adds a rich dimension to life, building relationship with the unseen world and the ancestors that are here. We don't have to believe in them for them to be here. They just are here. Though I think for those of us who are on this path, cultivating that relationship is a healthy one. Again, it's not just for the individual, the me. There is this multidimensionality.
Yeah, it strengthens our resolve. I think it adds a gravitas to our voice when we're acting on behalf of ourselves, if necessary, and the community, and the ecology, the environment. I think it's literally that, to use the cliche, it's like the ancestors have our back. And we're the voice of this generation, of this time. And the more we do that reparative work, the less what we in today's vernacular psychology might say, the guilt or the shame or the burden, I think what we're calling it tonight. I think the ability to speak from a place that acknowledges that and acknowledges the desire to help anyway.
Yeah.
It really, it's a way that it helps us connect with other people who are looking and seeking to connect.
Mhm.
And again, you said whether it's conscious or not, we know the ancestors are in the room when somebody has um, made themselves available to them, whether it's
Yeah.
putting an extra plate at our meal table or the ceremonies that we're referring to.
Hmm. So I wanted to ask you if you could share a little bit about how people can work with their ancestors. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about the Asclepius ritual in 2007, if that feels right for now, or not, maybe you could leave it for another time, up to you, or the Ancestral Story Project comes to
Yeah,
mind.
yeah. I think I could. I mean, the Asclepian was looking at was a research project related to the healing and health efficacy of non-denominational rituals. Right? So that was its own massive experience of looking about how we can be in a healing temple container together. But I think for tonight, it might make more a little sense in the context of what we're referring to. A couple of times we've had just down the hall at one of the oldest community halls down the road from us, where you married us, Mark and I, just imbued with people's stories, like their funerals to weddings to bar mitzvahs. It's a place where the community has gathered traditionally. It's in the wood. You can feel it, this wood that was harvested from this land. But so we had, gosh, I think the first one was back in the late 90s, where I've been part of Canada's moving around playback theater, which was telling personal real life stories, where you would sit in the teller's chair, tell a story, and you would choose other people to perform your story back from you. So not like psychodrama where you be inside of it. This is the theater. It's got a much stronger ritual function to it, performatively speaking. So what we did was we invited everybody to the hall, and we spent 3 days exploring our ancestry and performing we got to the oldest story in the room by the end of 3 days, which brought us back to the 16th century and the war between China and Japan. Right.
Wow.
So how we did that, and again, this would be working with a team to understand playback theater, but it just gives an example of what's possible. You would sit in the teller's chair, tell a story. Then you would choose to go down either your father or your mother's line. If you chose your mother, you would then sit in the teller's chair, the next time it was your round, and tell the oldest story you knew of that she carried. And then you would go back to your grandmother's story, and you would, as if you were your grandmother, tell that story. And we got to some people that had these century-old stories. Now, what's remarkable about what happened is that because you're choosing other people to play your father, your mother, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, your lovers, all of a sudden we're in this field where all our stories are incredibly enmeshed, and all of a sudden what happens is I'm being drawn into one of your ancestral themes, and it's totally awakening one of my ancestral themes. And you're casting me as your father or your brother or your sister, and the resonance. So you'll just have to take my word on faith for now, but over and over and over again, for those 32 participants, telling stories, each other's stories, and going deeper into each other's lineage, the field of ancestry woke up to the point where we were the patterns and rhythms would come out that people would go, oh my God, my grandfather had that tick, just the way you did it. Like the way your foot would shift to the left. Like, how would you have known to do that? Right. And there's no way the actor could have ever understood just based on hearing the story alone. But so what I'm saying is that we were literally feeling imbued. It was all like, I describe it when I teach it at witch camp and other places. It's like a mild aspecting. So we actually are opening up with permission by just agreeing to share our stories, that we're actually allowing the ancestors to come into us and do this healing mix of work where everybody's coming out of their triangularizations and all these lived patterns and attempting to revitalize. And ultimately, you could say on some level, forgive ourselves for some of the processes. And also to celebrate some of the pride of people's contributions. I'm not sure if I'm doing it justice, but
Oh, yeah.
and how we ended the whole thing off, I'll just finish it by saying, then everybody brought for our final feast their favorite ancestral food. And as they were serving up the food, they would serve up the story of their grandmother making this. For me, it was German sauerkraut. And how, oh my God, I've got to show this to you. 1 second. This came out of it, actually. Sorry if you can see my butt here. But so I had on the altar is my grandmother, my Oma's recipe cards, right? So, and here, so here's the sauerkraut recipe right here. So I get to have a visit with my grandmother. And so everybody got their own experience of bringing these sacred objects and parts of their lived experience. And the soulfulness in that room was life-changing for people. It was truly profound.
That's so beautiful. I can feel it. I can feel it. What I want to highlight in what you shared is how not everyone listening may know the word aspecting, but aspecting is a term we use in one of our traditions, which is almost like a possession. You're calling in that entity or that ancestor into your body, not to take it over entirely, but to come in and use your mouth to speak and use your being to communicate. What I loved in what you shared, and I think this is key, is how when we do these, when we create these opportunities and we invite these ancestors in, we are allowing them to have their own healing experience. So there they are on the other side of the veil, perhaps still troubled or perhaps moving through their evolutionary stage, or there might be pieces that are weighing on their spirit still. But when we do these healings, when we invoke them in these healing rituals, we're literally creating the stage for them to have a piece completed and healed, for us to have a piece completed and healed. They get to move on through what I sometimes imagine is like at the school of the afterlife. They get to move on, and we are too. We also get to move on and complete some pieces. So I just love how you described that, how there's that matrix that forms in the room with those 32 people, and suddenly all their ancestors are in this field, in this healing field together. I think that's just so beautiful.
We're in this constellation where everybody's stories are starting to resonate. And we notice that when we're in any deep event that starts to emerge. It's really fascinating to be able to enter into that portal through their ancestral lens. And there's a sense of everybody working on their piece together.
Yeah.
And this really, I love stories. I mean, it's such an honor to be witness and to be help carry people's stories. But ultimately, those stories also want to be composted.
Exactly.
Right? And they are anyway. Like we die 3 times. Ed often reminds us, our dear friend Ed, of all people, last time being the last time somebody mentions our name.
Yeah.
Right. And so we can, and all our friends will know, we often say when somebody dies, we often say what is remembered lives.
Yeah.
So that vitality again we're talking about comes back when we're able to actually let go of some of these generational burdens and actually become expressive conduits. That's the other side of it, that aspecting we're referring to, that we get to return to a place of freedom and expression again. Mm-hmm. And who wouldn't want that for our ancestors? Yeah.
Beautiful. Exactly. So what I want to just leave folks listening or watching just with a few other key pieces they can take home with them. And one of them is, as you described, playback theater, this kind of ritual which they can source out, or some people listening are skilled practitioners. So just a reminder that we can do that kind of work, which many of you watching already know how to do. And then just to circle back to what we were talking about when we began is just my practice that I love. It's so simple as you're falling asleep to make contact with a being that you sense or feel or imagine maybe an ancestral guide. And then another piece is for those of you who are in your own practices, what I like to do is just to make space for yourself, maybe light a candle, write in your journal, notice the themes that repeat in your life, the patterns, the themes that repeat in your life. So that might be, I'm just going to choose a common one. I heard earlier today, someone was talking about their painful shyness and lack of self-esteem despite being so-called successful in life.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was helping them see is how I asked them, what do you know about your parents and how they relate to that theme? And then what do you know about a grandparent that relates to that theme? Is shyness a story that has moved through your life? And of course it is. And they were able to identify a parent and also a grandparent. They were also able to identify it to a story of a grandparent who was publicly shamed in their town when they lived. And so we took that piece and we went into a meditative state. We call it trance or meditative state. And I had them just communicate to that one ancestor who's no longer on earth, who experienced that public shaming. And it was beautiful. You just create the opportunity for the conversation. I didn't facilitate it or force it. And this person had this opportunity in that meditative or trance state to communicate with that ancestor. And it was very moving. And they were just writing in their journal and having this dialogue. And what they were able to do is rewrite how the story ended. That's what this person wanted. That's what they were moved to do. When I asked, what is this ancestor asking for? And the answer was to rewrite the end of that story. And so they did. They rewrote the end of that story for that ancestor. And then as the person today came out of that meditative state, they realized that they can walk out in the world with a new sense of reassurance. They could feel lighter and recognize that they don't have to carry this burden anymore. It's as if their ancestor wanted them to metabolize that whole story, and they could because they're on the earth still. So this is another piece that I've learned. Those of us who are embodied on the earth, we have an advantage to metabolize, compost, circulate, rewrite, repattern certain stories that our ancestors may not be able to do on the other side. We tend to, because of the Judeo-Christian influence, we tend to romanticize the afterlife and that they have all the power, but that's not the case. We, the living, also have a power.
Yeah, it's our turn, both the blessing of that and the burden of that.
Yeah.
Right? And by virtue of that, we are the enactors of will right now, given all these contexts. And I think that's what you're speaking to very, very clearly, that's that ability to show up in the theme and not just focus on the objects of behavior that happens within a family system, but actually look to the themes. And by writing and reimagining and by being present in those themes and then seeing how they've impacted our own lives, we actually have the ability to then make some new choices, is what I'm hearing you say. And the person you were working with was able to actually rewrite it. It's beautiful. Right? And real or imagine, the feeling is the same, and the psyche will recognize that and can be then nourished by it.
Exactly. Yeah. So writing in our journal, engaging with our ancestors, connecting with them as we're falling asleep, playback theater or community ritual. Is there any other way that folks can?
I think I just want to can I slip in there? I just want to, because what you've spoken to in this last little section is that by working with our ancestors, we're providing an initiatory function, right? So by bearing witness to our ancestry, we're actually resolving the unwitnessed aspects of life, those betrayals, even those passions that never got witnessed.
Yeah.
for who people were, their desires, their contributions, and their pain. And by doing this work, we are then playing it, even though it's happening to us and through us, we're also in the sacred function of the witness,
Mm-hmm.
the conscious participatory witness, as in a Greek play, because these are our life stories are mythic. They're like Greek dramas in many cases. Somewhere in our lineage there is. So by being that witness, we're completing an ancestral initiation for our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
We're helping them put that to rest. And that's when I think we're really letting go of that burden.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. So beautiful.
Yeah. So I think to add to what you're saying as we're kind of bringing the container for tonight to a close, is to see that when we're working with our ancestors, we're attuning ourselves to our own initiatory patterns.
Mm-hmm.
We're agreeing in this form of magic, if you will, to be on the initiatory path. And that's a very distinct form of magic. And we can maybe pick up and talk about that a little bit more at another time, how initiatory spells and how initiations shape and guide us.
Yes.
And I think by understanding that and then circling back around to working with our ancestors, we'll be actually crafting our own spell work more consciously that way.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think what you're touching on, that initiatory rite and then crafting it, as you say, that's been the heart of, I don't know, dozens of rituals that we've done over the past 20 years. That is part of the deep magic of this path and these workings. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that at another time.
It'd be great to pick it up there.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Birch. Thank you for being here. And thank you to everyone listening or watching. And how can people get in touch with you, Birch? You offer one-on-one counseling sessions.
I do. And my website should be up and running in the next few weeks with Andrea, dear friend Andrea.
Yeah.
That's robertbirch.ca. So it's new for me. We'll be sharing some of these stories. There's a wonderful story. I actually was coming out of a ritual tonight out of something you helped me do with Suzanne and Karen. And I put up in the caves, talked about the caves calling, and I ended up in these caves and out from 6 or 7 years ago, wrapped in plastic. I found this story that I'd written and published called the Ancestral Tree of Knowledge.
Yes.
And it's working with the queer ancestors and the HIV, those living with HIV. So if you want to, I'll post that in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll post how people can get in touch with you and different resources and then to be continued. How about that?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I love you, dear. Thank you.
Love you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.